This video was brought to you by Ground News. When Finland and Sweden applied to join NATO in May of last year, breaking with a long tradition of geopolitical neutrality, there was a sense of triumphalism in the West. Putin's plan to deter NATO from further expansion had apparently backfired, and most politicians and analysts thought that Sweden and Finland's accession would be quick and easy, given their close relations with most other NATO members. Unfortunately for the West, though, things haven't quite gone as planned, largely thanks to Turkish President Erdogan's impossible demands. And as such, Sweden's accession now looks less likely than ever. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the most recent developments, why Erdogan is still refusing to let Sweden into NATO, and try and figure out what Erdogan really wants from this. Hint, it's probably not what he says he wants. Let's start with a quick recap. And by the way, we made a video about this a few weeks ago, so if you want more general detail, then you can watch that one. But the TLDR is that Sweden and Finland applied to join NATO in May. Erdogan said no, and then in late June, 3 countries signed a deal called the Trilateral Memorandum, which basically required Sweden and Finland to do 3 things. 1. Take a stronger stance against Kurdish groups. 2. Drop all embargoes on Turkey. For context, Sweden imposed an unofficial arms embargo on Turkey after Erdogan's invasion of northern Syria in 2019. And 3. Extradite certain so-called terror suspects to Turkey. Now, this was all going well until December, when the Swedish Supreme Court blocked the extradition of former Turkish journalist Bülent Kayniş. Now, Kayniş used to be the editor of a Turkish newspaper called Today's Zaman, which was often critical of Erdogan. He was then arrested in Turkey in 2015 for, quote, insulting the president in his tweets. And Today's Zaman was shut down by the Turkish government a year later. Kayniş was then released from prison after an appeal by his attorneys, before he fled to Sweden in 2016 after the failed coup, when the government issued a warrant for his arrest for apparently supporting the coup and being an ally of an exiled Turkish cleric that Erdogan considers responsible for the coup. Anyway, the Swedish Supreme Court blocked his extradition back to Turkey on the grounds that his extradition would leave him vulnerable to persecution and discrimination for his political beliefs, which is illegal under Swedish law. So, the Swedish government told Erdogan that they had to abide by the ruling, which didn't go down all too well in Turkey. And as such, Erdogan said that he couldn't sign off on Sweden's accession. In response, pro-Kurdish groups organized anti-Erdogan protests in Stockholm, which included hanging an unflattering effigy of Erdogan from a lamppost near Stockholm City Hall. The Swedish government made it clear that they didn't support the protests, but Erdogan was apparently still upset. So he summoned the Swedish ambassador over the incident and withdrew an invitation from the Swedish parliamentary speaker to visit Turkey. Then, a few weeks later, there was a protest of about 100 far-right activists outside the Turkish embassy in Sweden, where a far-right politician burned a copy of the Quran. Again, Erdogan summoned the Swedish ambassador and insisted that Turkey wouldn't approve of Sweden's NATO application as long as Quran burning was allowed in the country. Again, the Swedish government made it very clear that they didn't support these protests, but that they can't ban Quran burning because it would undermine the country's very principles of free speech. It's also worth mentioning that the permit for that demonstration was paid for by a far-right journalist called Chan Frick, who used to be a regular on Russia Today, and once even joked that Putin was his real boss. Regardless, this wasn't enough for Erdogan, and the Turkish foreign minister went as far as accusing the Swedish government of being complicit in what he described as a racist attack. With rhetoric heating up, Finland's foreign minister suggested that both sides needed a, quote, timeout, and the trilateral discussions on NATO accession were suspended. Finland's foreign minister also suggested that while they prefer joining NATO at the same time as Sweden, Finland would consider joining alone. For context, Erdogan has made it clear that he would approve Finland's application, just not Sweden's. So you get the idea. Erdogan isn't letting Sweden into NATO anytime soon because A, they won't extradite a journalist, and B, they still allow the burning of the Quran. At first glance, you might conclude that this means that, well, Sweden is never going to get into NATO. They can't extradite a journalist without overruling the Swedish Supreme Court, which would be both constitutionally questionable and deeply unpopular within the country. Similarly, they can't ban the burning of the Quran or effigies of Erdogan because it's not consistent with freedom of speech and because it will be politically impossible for Sweden's new centre-right government, who have put a lot of emphasis on free speech. Fortunately for Stockholm, though, there's probably still some hope for Sweden's NATO ambitions, because, well, Erdogan probably isn't being entirely honest about his demands. For starters, Erdogan probably knows that his demands are impossible, and they're suspiciously arbitrary. For example, he didn't mind when the Swedish Supreme Court blocked the extradition of another Kurd in July, and most NATO members, including the US, legally permit the burning of the Quran. So it is a bit odd that he's taken such an issue specifically with Sweden. So if Erdogan doesn't actually care much about these things, then why is he making such a fuss about them? Well, as we see it, there are basically two reasons. Firstly, he's thinking about the upcoming elections due in Turkey later this year. As we've covered in other videos, Erdogan is currently well behind every other presidential candidate in the polls. But by holding up Sweden's NATO application and taking a strong stance against Quran burning, he gets to look like a powerful world leader while also playing to his Muslim base. The second thing he probably really wants, though, is F-16s and F-35s. For context, Turkey, like most of the world, relies on American F-16 fighter jets for its air force. In fact, in the 2010s, Erdogan decided to upgrade Turkey's air force by buying a whole load of F-35s, which are essentially the next generation F-16s. However, in 2019, Turkey bought a Russian-made S-400 air defense system. But the US had previously warned that if Turkey did buy this Russian system, they'd be excluded from the F-35 program. Now, Erdogan presumably thought the US was bluffing, but they weren't, and they immediately cut Turkey out of the F-35 program, despite the fact that Turkey had already paid for 4 F-35s, costing something like $1.4 billion. Then, a couple of years later, Turkey asked to buy 70 more F-16s, but the sale was blocked by Congress. Obviously, Erdogan wasn't happy about this, but he stayed relatively quiet about it until this month, when he started bringing it up pretty regularly. Clearly, the implication here is that Turkey will be more amenable on the issue of Sweden's NATO accession if the US becomes more amenable regarding F-16s and F-35s. Ultimately then, there may be a path towards Sweden's accession. It might not be easy, it might not be politically popular, you might not like it, but if these are the two things that Erdogan really wants, they're at least slightly more achievable. Nonetheless, it's hard to predict what politicians and countries across the world really want to do next about this Erdogan-Sweden issue. In fact, it's always pretty difficult to judge what other people in other places think. Fortunately though, Ground News is here to help you with this very issue. Ground News is a website and app that lets you compare how breaking news is covered around the world. That's because for every story, you get bias, factuality, and ownership ratings for the news sources that are reporting on the topic. That makes it a fantastic way to access global news from a diverse array of viewpoints, so that you can see how international stories are being covered by news outlets on the ground or in neighboring countries. For example, I can quickly compare headlines from government-affiliated sources to get a sense of how governments, even democratically elected ones, can steer media coverage. And Ground News truly is global. They have several editions to make sure that you're getting the news that is relevant to your region, including 4,000 news sources here in the UK alone. And if you want more than that, an even more customized experience, then you can follow specific people, places, or topics that interest you most, like politics, Europe, or the economy. It's really a fascinating way to read the news. It gives you a variety of sources and far more information about the news than any other app out there. So if you want to give it a try, you should head over to ground.news/TLDR, where you can subscribe to get unlimited access to all of their features and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.